me, but all right. So
True.
I'm going to go down Jay's route and talk about my kind of home country here, Israel. And as you can see on the map, it's obviously a divided nation. You've got Israel proper, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan and whatnot. But Israel's also a nation divided within itself. There's the right wing and the slightly less right wing. And that creates a problem in Israel because they don't have innovative solutions to the Palestinian crisis. They think that they have two different sides, but they're really just one side, and they can't get out of the box. So that brings me to the topic of my PubSpeak, innovative solutions in the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, or why Benjamin Netanyahu needs to be smacked in the face. The problem is that they can't get out of this rut, and they need to, because it's a crisis now, not just a conflict. Because in September, the Palestinian delegation to the United Nations is going to put forward a motion for statehood, and it's going to pass, because there's a lot of Arab and third world countries that are definitely going to vote for it. And when they do that, Israel will be invading a sovereign nation, which is going to create a diplomatic headache. So it would be best for everybody, of course it's not going to happen, but it would be best for everybody if it was solved by September. But what led Israel to this kind of inside-the-box constrained thinking in the first place? Well, it starts with Zionism, obviously. Zionism is the movement to create a Jewish state in Israel. And there were two major factions of Zionism, labor Zionism and, revisionist Zionism. Labor Zionism was advocated by this guy, Theodor Herzl. He was a reporter during the Dreyfus Affair, and he organized the first World Zionist Conference. And labor Zionism was pretty much socialist. You had kibbutzim, which are collective farms, and you worked them. But what he didn't take into account was the Arabs. He thought the Arabs in the region would be so happy for the Jewish money and the Jewish work and everything that they just kind of submit to their rule. But the alternative is even worse. Revisionist Zionism was advocated by this guy, Zev Jabotinsky, and he was a commander in the Jewish Legion of the British Armed Forces in World War I. And he advocated for a concept called the Iron Wall, which is pretty much never trust anybody. The Jews have been oppressed for thousands of years. There's no way we can trust anybody else. So these were the two sides, and neither of them had a solution to the Arabs. So that was in the 1880s. And obviously, the big event that created Israel was the Holocaust. And that solidified the Jewish psyche. We can never compromise. We can never appease. We can never give in to enemies at all. In fact, the revisionist Zionists went far enough that they killed a UN negotiator who had freed Jews from concentration camps because he was advocating for a Palestinian state. So this is the situation in Israel when they become independent. And two parties developed, the Labor Party, which is labor Zionism, and the Likud Party, which means the consolidation, the ultra-conservative party. And Israel went along, mostly labor-dominated, but the big election that solidified Israel's stance was in 1996 for prime minister. And it was a battle between two martyrs, shall we say. One of them was Yonatan Netanyahu. He was a special forces operative, and he led Operation Thunderbolt, there was an airplane of mostly Israeli, some French, and it was kidnapped by Palestinian terrorists and German anarchists, and it was led to Uganda. And he led a daring operation. They disguised as Ugandan troops. It was ridiculous. And they came in, and they got all the hostages out. The only casualty was Yonatan Netanyahu. So he became this big martyr. This was in '76. And his brother, Benjamin Netanyahu, U.S. educated, kind of a sleazebag, he says, we won't let my brother die in vain. And he's not religious at all, but he used the religious right in Israel, they have that too, and to co-opt them to support his policies. The second martyr was in 1995. His name was Yitzhak Rabin, and he was the prime minister that negotiated the Oslo Accords, the first and only major step toward peace that Israel has really ever had. It didn't go far enough, but it was a start. But then, in a rally in Tel Aviv, he was killed by this guy Yigal Amir, a Jew, who thought that he had gone too far toward appeasing the Palestinians, and so he killed him. So the election was between Shimon Peres, a labor guy who was Yitzhak Rabin's friend and rival, versus Benjamin Netanyahu, the brother of Yonatan. And both sides played up the martyr card, and by a 50.5 to 49.5 vote, Netanyahu won. And he used Republican campaign strategists and negative ads, and therefore the Oslo peace process was stopped, any chance of peace was gone, and this is where we are today. So in current Israeli politics, the Labor Party collapsed after that, and they fell into a centrist party called Kadima. And that means there's even less variety in Israeli solutions to the crisis. It's kind of center or right. And in 2009, they re-elected Netanyahu after he'd been years out of power because of his failures. So he's back in power now. And he's brought back revisionist Zionism and the concept of the Iron Wall. And the Iron Wall is a mental separation, but it also is a physical wall. There's a wall here that separates Gaza and the West Bank from Israel. There's also troops, planes, secret nukes that you're not supposed to know about. But most importantly, it's just a mental separation. For instance, I took a course on this last summer, and my professor, he was living in Israel, he called up a West Bank radio station for, a phone-in, and he said that was the first time they'd ever had an Israeli call. In fact, 80% of Israelis think that Arabs should not have a role, Israeli Arabs should not have a role in government. So there's obviously a huge mental gap in Israel that prevents them from thinking of innovative solutions, the solutions they need to come up with to get out of their problem here. So what are these solutions? How can Israel fix this problem? Well, the first is something called a vertical sovereignty divide. Now, they take for a model West Berlin, and that's obviously not a good city. You think of the problems there, but it has this interesting thing called, it's a suburb called Steinstücken. And it was, by some weird quirk of geography, separated from the rest of West Berlin. And so the Allies agreed with the Soviets that they build a road from West Berlin to Steinstücken. The problem was there was a Soviet railroad that went under. So they agreed that the railroad and the ground would be Soviet territory or East German territory, and the road above it and the airspace would be West German territory. And this can apply to Jerusalem right here. The big thing in Jerusalem is obviously the Temple Mount. It's the holiest site in Judaism, and the Dome of the Rock on top is the third holiest site in Islam. So both sides have a claim to it. So what you would do is just divide it vertically. The top, like the Dome of the Rock, would be Palestinian, and the bottom would be Israeli. And the reason that might seem unfair to the Israelis, how could they get up there? Israelis don't even want to be on the Temple Mount, because there's a fear that they might accidentally step on the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could go in. And this is a serious thing. So they don't even want to be on the Temple Mount, they just want to have it. So this solution could work. And it's something that they need to think of, but they really haven't. And then, where'd my marker go? Okay, so up here is the Golan Heights. Now, unlike the West Bank and Gaza, the Israelis really have no claim to the Golan Heights. There's no Jews there. There's no Israeli settlers there. It was pretty much just taken in the '67 war to give a buffer zone between Syria and Israel. But the people who do live here are called the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. They're not Islamic, but they splintered off Shia Islam. And they're very strictly monotheistic, but they've been persecuted by the Shia for thousands of years. And so, what Israel should do, since they really don't have a claim to the Golan Heights, is make it a Druze state. And that would mean that the Druze, who have been supporting the cruel dictator al-Assad in Syria, the guy who's in the news for all these atrocities, they've been supporting him because he's not a normal Shia Muslim, so he supported the Druze over the Shia. But if you gave the Druze their own state, they'd turn against Assad. Like, Assad didn't give us our own state. And so that would make the Druze happy, it would get rid of this problem up here, and it would destabilize a very terrible Syrian regime. So that's another thing they can do, but the Israelis are so focused on land gains that they just say, oh, we have to have the Golan Heights. The problem is also in this area here, and just all over, are refugees. People who are Palestinians mostly, who were kicked out in the '67 and '48 wars, and now it's their grandchildren and great-grandchildren pretty much. And so they're living around here, and they want to come back to Israel. But the Israeli government is saying no, because that would disrupt the Jewish majority in Israel. Hundreds of thousands of refugees, and it would no longer be a Jewish state. So, President Clinton, in the Camp David talks in 2000, came up with something called the Clinton parameters, and this was his idea. Let's say you have here. This used to be a Palestinian settlement, and then in the 60 years or so since the wars, Israelis came in and moved there. And you obviously can't tell these Israelis to move out. I mean, these people probably weren't even alive during the war, so they have a right to be there too. So what you would do is the Palestinians would settle here, pretty close to their home, and still in the state of Israel. So they get what they want, but they don't force Israelis off the land. Then, when the Palestinians and Israelis finally come down and decide the border, they'd do a land swap, something like that. So that the Palestinian settlement would be included in the West Bank, and they'd be with their countrymen, and the Israelis' Jewish statehood would not be disrupted, but the Palestinians would still get to come back to Israel and still be very close to their land. So, this solution would work, but there was way too much opposition. Even from the Israelis, they say, I don't care, I don't want them on our land at all, never. Let's see. The problem is, though, that the Israelis are kind of hypocrites here, because they have settlers in the West Bank and in Gaza. And these settlers are ultra-religious Jews who think that they have the right to take over all of greater Israel, and that it's all a Jewish state, so they might as well move there. And Israel is saying, okay, the settlers are living here, here, and here, and here. In the final peace talks, that should be our land, because there are Jews living on it. And the Palestinians say, no, they just took our land. So, the solution would perhaps be to just let the settlers stay where they are and become Palestinian citizens. Now that might seem, cruel to the settlers, but here's the thing. Most of them are smart enough not to stay in Palestine if they're these cruel, oppressive settlers. So they would move back to Israel, and that would solve most of the problem. The ones that stayed, who were so devoted that they would stay, would still be safe, though, because the Palestinian government relies on settlers for economic assistance. The settlers hire workers, they produce a large part of the GDP of Palestine, so they would have a huge economic incentive to keep them safe. And so that way, the settlers could stay there, but they wouldn't become part of Israel, and that would make the Palestinians happy too. In line with the settlements, there's the wall. The wall doesn't run along the Green Line, which is the border between the West Bank and Israel, though. The wall kind of meanders in and out. It encloses settlements, and it moves around strategic locations that Israel wants. And Israel is pretty much just establishing facts on the ground here. They're going to say, whenever final negotiations come, okay, the wall's here, we want everything on our side, even if we decided where the wall was in the first place. So, and the wall has also cut off people from their farms, it's prevented people from getting to hospitals, it's really a terrible thing, and the Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. And there's even comparisons to the Holocaust, which are a bit far-fetched, but they certainly have some merit. So, what do you do about the wall? It's kind of the same thing with the settlers. You just let it stay there. Because most of the wall is in Palestinian territory, most of the wall would therefore become Palestinian. The Israelis would not want the Palestinians to have all the sensors and machinery and weaponry that are on this wall. This is like yards wide and barbed wire and everything. So the Israelis would probably just take it down because they wouldn't want the Palestinians to have it, and that would just pretty much end the problem, end Israel's usurpation of the land, and it would give the Palestinians access without really doing too much harm to Israel itself. But this whole area is a desert, and water is a problem. And as was beautifully colored in by Sarah Jamal, there's not so much water around. Most of the water starts up here on the Sea of Galilee, comes down the Jordan River, and ends in the Dead Sea, which is too salty to drink. So this is the only water in the region. The Israelis, though, have been making long pipelines from the Sea of Galilee down to here. This region is called the Negev. It's a huge desert, but in this kind of the same vein as the settlers, they think, oh, we need to populate the whole land of Israel. So they've done actually really amazing geoengineering, putting grassland and trees and everything down here in the Negev. But they've taken a lot of water, and there were water shortages in the West Bank because of it. So what's the solution there? Well, obviously, you need to divide up the water by people. If Israel has 2 times as many people as Palestine, they get 2 times the water from here. That makes sense. But Israel's currently taking a lot more than that for their projects down here. So, since Israel had this big natural deficit down here, they should use the natural resources that they have up here, the Mediterranean Sea. And they've already started work on some desalination plants, but they should really do more work on them and really facilitate using desalinated water for the Negev, and then just letting the Sea of Galilee be drinking water. And that way Israel can use its natural resources to create more, whereas they're not stealing from the Palestinians. And it would also create jobs and such, so it wouldn't be too much of a hassle for Israel to do anyway. And the big problem, as you see on the map, is that the West Bank and Gaza aren't connected. And there's no way Israel's going to give up a strip of land in here for them to be connected. So So the problem, though, it's not just transportation and economy. Hamas, which is a pretty bad terrorist organization, doesn't recognize Israel, controls Gaza, whereas the Palestinian Authority controls the West Bank, and they recognize Israel, and they're relatively democratic. So Israel's not willing to go into Gaza. They're like, that's your problem, but the Palestinian Authority can't get there. So what you would do is some sort of road between them, obviously. But then there's more problems with that. If it's on the ground, there's a ton of security concerns, obviously. Suicide bombers, Hamas coming in, whatnot. If it's overground or in a tunnel, that's millions and millions of dollars for this huge stretch of road. So what you would do is just kind of sink it in the ground, and it would be at a depth that wouldn't be like jumpable, but wouldn't be like deep underground. And Israel would, since it's going through their territory, have the right to patrol it for, you know, terrorists and car bombs and whatnot. And you might think that's kind of unfair, though, because Israelis would, you know, check every car and do profiling and all that stuff, all the stuff we're worried about in Arizona. So the thing is, though, that all the settlements in the West Bank also have roads going to them, and those roads go through Palestinian territory. And at the moment, they're Israeli-controlled. But in exchange for building this road and having Israel have the right to patrol every single car that goes through it, the Palestinians just kind of naturally should have the right to patrol cars that go to the settlements. And that way, it's a fair and equitable solution. So, Israel is stuck in this rut. There's two parties, but they're not different, and they're not getting anywhere. And these days, there's the whole Arab Spring. In Egypt, Israel is worried that the Muslim Brotherhood will be democratically elected. And the Muslim Brotherhood is in line with Hamas. They're very anti-Israel. But if they're democratically elected, Israel really can't do that much. And there's a possibility that that will happen. Whereas Israel likes the Arab Spring in Syria, because Assad has never, ever wanted to come to the table, and he's oppressed people, and he's anti-Israel. So Israel has to walk a fine line here. And I think the best solution would just be to step out of their box, move past their kind of constraining 1.5 parties, and to give the Palestinians statehood. And that way, Egypt won't elect the Muslim Brotherhood if the problem is solved. The Druze will destabilize Syria, and Assad will have no reason to go off on Israel about how they torture the Palestinians and whatnot. And Israel won't get into the diplomatic nightmare that will happen if the UN gives Palestine statehood. So Israel just needs to step out of the box.